Hello friends, welcome to Crossroads, an initiative by ClearIAS where you try to study important events in an interlinked fashion. To tell you about the program, we try to connect different subjects like history, polity, economy and current affairs. We keep them on a timeline and try to follow them in a chronological order. So this helps you to remember things better, in a better way, and also to relate what was happening in and around our country. So previous video which we had done covered the period from 1945 to 1960, and this current video will be covering the period from 1960 to 1970. In the background, if you are listening some sort of noise, it's because it's raining heavily over here, so please bear with that. Okay. So as you had requested that you needed a little more of discussions during this program, while going through this video, of course I have tried to take that into consideration, but because of the requirement of this video, or the objective of the video is to give you a foolproof idea or a background or a bird's eye view of things in a larger perspective, so we won't be able to, or we won't have enough time to cover everything. So every events would be discussed, but we won't be getting time to deeply delve into that. Okay, so what I have taken into consideration is that I'll be trying to give you a peripheral information about each event, and then the detailed studies could be done while we do our self studies. We can actually, if we have this timeline and entire idea, so the multidimensional view helps you in connecting things easily. It also helps you in essay writing and also in general studies as such. Okay, so let's get going. I'm Honey Matthew and I'm an educator at ClearIAS. So before we start this video, let me just quickly go through the things that we had discussed in the previous video. In the previous video, we had discussed about a world after the Second World War, and we knew that this world was completely different comparatively, because it set up a new system in this world regarding most of the matters like economics or social or cultural matters. And after the Second World War, the world was divided into two superpower blocks, which was US and USSR, butting into each other for their ideological benefits. Okay, and in India also, the situation was not that good, because we had to face the Indo-Pakistani War of 1947, which of course was something really hard for a newly independent country to face. Anyways, we also discussed about Israel's formation in 1948 and the resultant issues that generated from there. We also talked about the economic aspects, the planning way of doing things, and the 5-year plans. We discussed about the mixed economy concept, and also this formation of planning commission as in to guide the socialist idea of bringing in development, or the socialistic perspective of bringing in development. And also we discussed about the issue of integration of princely states, which was actually carried out in a very brilliant way by Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel with his threefold Patel scheme. And we discussed about how Junagadh and Hyderabad and Kashmir actually became part of India as such. We also discussed about the Korean War, as in we can say that the Cold War effect after the World War II. This was something that was actually dooming the entire world at that time. We also discussed about the economic policies, the nationalization processes that was happening, the nationalization of Air India, the nationalization of SBI and LIC, etc. We also discussed different aspects of the world happenings, and that was in a way molding the shape of the world to come. So before we move on to the next period, that is 1960 to 1970, let me just tell you that we'll be discussing about few things that had happened in the previous years too, which I had missed in the previous video, or I have taken to make it easy to relate with the things. Okay, so let us start. I have also shared this link of the previous video if you just want to go back and listen to the previous video if you had not listened to it, and if you want to just join back after you listen that. Okay. So we move on to the political scenario of India. So I have decided to start this video with Indian scenario, and then we'll be moving out to the world look and then coming back to India. So it will be a zooming in and zooming out process all the time. Okay. So the political scenario of India. So the political journey in India actually was not an easy ride, because India had just got independence and we are just taking our baby steps into this democratic setup. So we had several issues to face. Also, a war we had to face, and linguistic and the integration issues and all these kind of issues were already surfacing up. But along with that, there was another scenario that Congress was holding a major hold, or was a major stakeholder in all these political discussions and all. So until the second general election, no major party was seen to emerge as a major opposition to Congress until the formation of Swatantra Party. Actually, Swatantra Party was formed on 4th June 1959, shortly after the Nagpur session of Indian National Congress, and it was formed by C. Rajagopalachari along with Murari Vaidya and Minu Masani, who was a classical liberal and also a critic of socialist ideology of Nehru. Until then, we don't see a major party evolving with liberal point of view until this Swatantra Party was formed. So you know that this right-wing element or groups or parties, they had existed earlier, but they were only known at local and regional levels. But Swatantra Party's formation was the first attempt to bring these highly fragmented right-wing forces together under the umbrella of a single party. So the provocation for formation of such a party, we need to know that why such a party emerged. It was because in the Avadi session, if I'm pronouncing it right, AVADI, in the Avadi session of Congress in 1955, Congress had explicitly stated that and adopted a resolution that it aims to establish a socialistic pattern of society. Well, this socialistic pattern of society was not well taken by most of the people. In Congress, it was largely supported, but anyhow, people like Rajagopalachari and Murari Vaidya, they had more liberal outlook regarding the development, and that is the reason why a formation of this type of party came in at this time. And that is what we kind of mentioned, that Swatantra Party stood for a market-based economy with license Raj. So they, with license Raj dismantled. So they were not in view of this license Raj. They always favored a more liberal economy compared to what Jawaharlal Nehru claimed or the Congress aimed for. And that is the reason why by the next general election in 1967, the Swatantra Party had become a significant force in some parts of India. It won around 8.7% of votes and became the single largest opposition party in the 4th Lok Sabha. I think we had this question about opposition party in India in prelims itself, 2018, I guess, yes. So this was one of the changes in the political scenario in India, which was leading to a development of different, or we can say bringing in a political diversity during this time when it was complete monopoly of Congress at this time. Okay. So, however, there is one point to remember, that this right-wing party was not a communal party, as in they only favored the liberal outlook of that right-wing ideology. Okay. So we know that this political scenario, while this was happening, there was another issue that we had to face, and it was about integration of different territories into India. Especially, there were many states in India which were still under foreign influence, or which were still foreign colonies, like Goa, Portuguese, Daman and Diu, Dadra and Nagar Haveli, etc. So this was one other major process that was happening. Meanwhile, we are discussing about several things, and In the starting of the 1960s, the first major issue that we had to face was about the Berubari Union case. So before we move on to the next event of the timeline, I will take a little bit of time to discuss what exactly happened or what was the case regarding the Berubari Union case. So we know that India and Pakistan boundary was fixed by Sir Ratcliffe, and the line was called Ratcliffe Line. However, some disputes arose because of the erroneous depiction of the maps by the Ratcliffe Award. So basically, in this Ratcliffe Award, the boundary was determined on the basis of the boundaries of the thanas, each thana or each region which existed during the British time. Okay, so what happened was, while this Ratcliffe Award or while this boundary was being created, accidentally or we can say erroneously, one thana was missed out, and that thana included this Berubari Union. So there arose a dispute between India and Pakistan regarding the claim for this Berubari Union. So Pakistan said Berubari Union belongs to us, and India was like, no, we have it. So anyways, the dispute was resolved by Nehru-Noon Agreement. So there was this agreement, this agreement called Nehru-Noon Agreement of 1958, where it was decided that half of this Berubari Union will go to Pakistan and half of the adjacent portion lying with India will remain with India. So this question was taken into Supreme Court as well, because there was a doubt or there was a question, there was a presidential reference regarding this, just to ask that transferring of a territory from India to a foreign country, does that need a simple amendment procedure or does it need a special amendment procedure, for which Supreme Court had passed its order that if you have to secede territory from India to the foreign country, then you will have to do it through a special amendment act under Article 368. So we know about Article 3 and 4, which says that we can change the boundaries, we can include and make new states out of it, etc. But all these things can be done through simple procedure, simple amendment procedure. But unlike that, here it has been stated that cessation of territories from India to the foreign countries need a special amendment under Article 368. Okay, so this was about the Berubari Union case. And after that, another internal struggle that India faced was regarding the inclusion of regions which were still under the foreign power. So we all know about Dadra and Nagar Haveli, right? So this Dadra and Nagar Haveli, this was a Portuguese ruled territory until its liberation in 1954. Well, this is not the picture of Dadra and Nagar Haveli. So until 1954. But it was in 1961 that it was changed into or converted or included into as a union territory. Then the next one was Goa. Goa was a state which was under the Portuguese power. It was a Portuguese colony basically. And in 1961, after continual petitions for a peaceful handover, India invaded and annexed the Portuguese colony of Goa on the west coast of India, and it becomes a union territory under the Operation Vijaya. So these things were happening in 1961, and along with that there was another region which was the region of Daman and Diu. The region of Daman and Diu became a part of India in 1961 itself, and later the three territories of Goa, Daman and Diu was formed into a union territory. So I think you can remember, because I think this chronological order of states formation is something which we need to keep in mind. So in 1961, what happens is this Goa, Daman and Diu, Dadra and Nagar Haveli, all of these union territories come into existence. We can kind of remember in that order. Okay, so before we move on to the next issue that India had to face, let us just think that we are slowly moving on to the outer side. Like we'll be talking about India and China, because that is something which comes up or which crops up in this timeline in the year 1962, and as you all know, the Indo-China War. So recently there were a lot of talks about this Indo-China issue and border issue. Right now we are also discussing about this dispute between India and China and the discord or the kind of strain we are facing. But it is right time to discuss about the 1962 war that we faced that India and China had with each other. Okay, so I think you remember in the last video, I had told you about this Tibetan uprising and India giving asylum to Dalai Lama, which acted as one of the triggers for Indo-China war, right? So I hope you just remember that. But before getting into the war actually, let us just see what exactly led to Indo-China war. Okay. So this battle or the Indo-China war was over the disputed border land areas of Aksai Chin and Arunachal Pradesh. India claimed that Aksai Chin is a part of Ladakh. Basically, it is a huge desert of salt flat plain which has been under Chinese occupation since 1950s. Okay, they had illegally occupied Aksai Chin, so this was one of the starting point of a dispute between India and China. So even though the regions between India and China had not been demarcated well, but these borders were well defined by various treaties and rights since the colonial period. So India had issue with illegal annexation of Indian territory without its knowledge. Okay. So while this was happening, another reason for discord between India and Pakistan emerged, and that was the invasion of Tibet by China. So this was a blatant aggression because Tibet had never been a part of China. So this was taken as as a matter of constraint, or as a matter of as a big matter of self-pride by Tibetans, and Tibetans looked up to India for help. But India at that time, we had this Panchashil agreement with China in 1954 and all. So we were not that aggressive in our demands, and we were like very peaceful. Okay, we'll keep it chill and we'll be like that. So it's like we didn't want a war as such. But anyways, the Dalai Lama had to leave Tibet, and this was where I had discussed in the last video also that this was a trigger point because Dalai Lama was given asylum in India, and he had formed a government in exile here in India. So, in order to see, while all these things were happening, while China was illegally, acquiring different places, India had to counter these measures, right? To counter these measures, India embarked on a policy which is known as the forward policy, as you can see. Basically, this policy was that India will be establishing a series of small posts all along its northern and eastern borders. Okay, so what is it basically? That we will be developing small posts, infrastructural like things which will be meant for frontline defense. Okay, so if anything happens, we can just kind of we can ensure that we have a defense things at setup. Okay, so while this forward policy was being initiated, but one issue with this forward policy was that even though we decided of setting up small posts, our posts or these defense posts were not that strong enough or infrastructurally well or defined, or they were not that equipped enough to face any sort of aggression from Chinese side. Okay. So now in 1962, what happened? That China's before we move on to that, we need to know that India was building up a slow defense procedure over here, and China was also actively getting into aggressive idea. So China actually, before getting into an aggressive mode, they had offered a diplomatic settlement in 1960, like throughout 1960 and 62, but India was not ready to accept that. And after that, Chinese military, they gave up on their diplomatic settlement system, and they started growing their aggressive actions. So in the next thing that we are discussing, we see that China finally abandoned all the peaceful resolution and it invaded a disputed land along the border, which you see as along the McMahon line. The China's People's Liberation Army, it invaded India one in Ladakh region and across the McMahon line in the then northeastern frontier region, okay, which is now the Arunachal Pradesh region, and it inflicted a heavy damage on Indian forces, okay. So again, later on 10th of October, basically in the beginning of this Indian War happened, and a border dispute involving two of the world's largest nation occurred. Okay, so it was on 10th October when formally this war started. Later, the Chinese or the China's People's Liberation Army, they tried to invade Kashmir and they capture Aksai Chin region. So this is basically, as you see, this is the Aksai Chin region. Okay. So after this war, after like all along this like October to till November, this war happened, and then later on, China ended the war on with a ceasefire being declared on 20th November 1962, and we had to face a heavy damage, not just on the basis of the number of military personnel or the defense basis, but also on the basis of economic setback that India had to face after this war. Okay, then we can say that it announced during the end of this war, with the ceasefire being announced, China said that it will withdraw itself to its claimed line of actual control. Okay, so this is one thing. So we discussed about McMahon line, we discussed about line of actual control, and yeah. So this is now. While we are discussing what was happening in India, don't you want to know what was happening in the world at this time? So let us move to our world view. So while India was engaged in this fight with its neighbor, other major world powers were engaged in yet another showcasing of Cold War effects. That is one of the major issues that we have to discuss, which is the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Along with that, before we start, we have another major issue that we have to discuss before as we switch to the world view. This was something that I had missed in the previous video, so I just thought of mentioning it here, and then we move on to the Cuban Missile Crisis. So let us quickly go through this Suez Crisis. So the Suez Crisis began on October 29, 1956, when Israeli armed forces pushed into Egypt towards the Suez Canal after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, who nationalized the canal. Okay. So the Suez Crisis was something which you can say that was leading into many other crises later on in this particular region. But yeah, let's just go into it. So this Egyptian president, he nationalized this canal, which was a valuable waterway that controlled 2/3 of the oil used by the Europe. Okay, so this was something triggering a bigger issue, because this is a crisis, because this was a place where Europe was taking away 2/3 of its oil. So controlling and nationalizing this Suez port was seen as a bigger crisis in Europe and also in its adjacent portion of Israel, which was just newly formed. Okay, so because Israel raised this issue, Israeli forces were supported by French and British forces, and therefore it led to a crisis again called the Suez Crisis, which began in 1956. Okay, so by this time, when the Suez Crisis happened, in the end, actually, Egypt emerged victorious, and the British and French and Israeli governments, they withdrew their troops in late 1956. Okay, so this is something we just need to know that in 1956, a sort of crisis called Suez Crisis had erupted. And this is important, as I had said, because you will be learning about another 6-day war, which we'll be following in this timeline. So you can connect things. So that is why I just referred here, and also because I had not mentioned it in the last video. So the Suez Crisis happened in 1956, but there is something very important related to India and Suez Crisis that I can take time to mention. Okay, which is that in 1956, when the Suez Canal Company was seized by Egyptian government, an international conference had happened, okay? And in this conference, everybody voted whether they supported or whether they are against this Egyptian action. And Egypt got only 4 votes in favor of its action. And one of those 4 backers of Egypt was India. And that's something important because this showcases how India was raising out its voice as a third world country voice, and it was emerging as a new leader in this field. And the other 4 backers, the other members were like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and USSR. So we can see that USSR and US were coming up in a conflict again because Europe was on the other side and USSR on this side. So this is something important to know because India was emerging in the international relationship sphere as well. Then also there is another thing that India had opposed the partition of Palestine and the 1956 invasion of Sinai by Israel. So we have known that in 1956 Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula, and this was also opposed by India. Okay, but anyways, in India's stance, there is something I just wanted to mention, and it was that it did not oppose this pro-democratic movement in Hungary. Okay, so it's because I just mentioned it here because in 1956 all these things were happening. What were those things? In 1956 there was a Suez crisis that had erupted, and also there was this Palestine issue that was happening because the Palestine was being partitioned, and also a pro-democracy movement was happening in Hungary. Okay, so this is something which we can remember for the 1956 timeline, just to mention it. Okay, so India was actually having a prominent stand on various international events, and this brought it under a limelight as the voice of the emerging third world country. Okay, so these opinions were actually very important because that is leading us to something else which happened in 1961, and that is the non-aligned movement. Okay, so drawing on the principles agreed at Bandung Conference in 1955, again something important, there was this Bandung Conference in 1955 where this non-aligned movement was established in 1961. It was established in Belgrade, and Serbia, Yugoslavia, through an initiative of Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, and the Yugoslav President Joseph Broz Tito. Okay, so we can say that we all know what was the major perspective of NAM. It was to not involve in either of these power block games and to remain independent and have its own independent voice. And of course, it was a voice against the colonial or the imperial nations during that time, involved in all these kind of movements against those countries who have seriously, emerged, who are now emerging out of this colonial period and power. And also, they were in support of those countries, freedom of those countries who were still under imperial rules. Another issue that we need to know is that in 1960 we had this Indus Water Treaty under the signed between India and Pakistan, which was brokered by World Bank in 1960, and it decided that all the waters of 3 rivers, namely Ravi, Satluj, and Beas, were allocated to India for exclusive use. Okay, so we know about this Indus Water Treaty. We had been discussing, or we had learned it in many of the current affair materials, because recently there was a talk about whether we need to continue with this treaty or not, whether we need to give water to Pakistan or not. So there was this issue and discussion going on. So it happened in 1960. So just to keep it in a timeline. Okay. So considering India's movement, we have seen what had happened in India in the 1960s, beginning with the Swatantra Party and then moving on to the integration of foreign occupied colonies into India, and also about the Indo-China War that happened in 1962. And we then went into a worldwide view about what was happening. So we switched a little bit, we had to rewind a little bit. We went into 1956 Suez crisis because we need to know what is happening and how India was developing and how this international presence of India was getting limelight. Okay, so we talked about Suez crisis, India's stand regarding that, and we also talked about the non-aligned movement. Okay, so because we have discussed about it, let us go into what we had actually started. So during the Indo-China War, when India was busy having this war, US and USSR were having another major crisis or major content between each other, which was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It is also known as the October Crisis of 1962. It was a 13-day confrontation between United States and the Soviet Union. It was initiated by the American discovery of Soviet ballistic missile deployment in Cuba. Okay, so let me just give you a little bit of information about why the Cuba Missile Crisis is so important, or what actually happened. Okay, so after seizing power in Caribbean island nation of Cuba, because leftist party, there's Fidel Castro, he came into power in 1959, and he aligned himself with the Soviet Union. So this was already taken very seriously because we know that it was a Cold War period, and already this world, in Korea also there was this division, and Indonesia, in Vietnam also this issue was there. So this kind of Cold War crisis was actually building up during this time. And it was during this time when in Cuba, this leftist party under Fidel Castro grows and aligns with the Soviet Union. Under Fidel Castro, Cuba grew dependent on Soviets for military and economic aid. And during this time, US and Soviets, of course, we know, they were not that seriously into any sort of friendly relation, okay? So the two superpowers, they plunged into one of their biggest Cold War confrontation. So basically what happened is an American pilot, he was just going through over this Cuban region, and he photographed a medium-range ballistic missile being assembled for installation in Cuba. And they knew that because Cuba lies very near to American coasts, so this was taken as an alarming situation, and this led to a crisis, okay? So this was this Cuban Missile Crisis, and somehow everybody feared that we'll soon have a nuclear attack. But anyhow, the tensions were eased off, and the negotiations were held beautifully, and yeah, we survived that era, thankfully. Okay, so in 1962, we just got a glimpse of what was happening in the world. Meanwhile, okay, so let's just switch back to India. So, as you know, the war was going on. Meanwhile, in 1962, another thing also happened, which was the integration of French-ruled Pondicherry into India as a union territory. So let me just remind you, this integration of Pondicherry had actually started in 1954 itself. Okay, the French handed over the territory to India in 1954, but it was, finally acquired or formally acquired and made into a union territory by the 14th Constitutional Amendment in 1962 only. Okay, so technically we can say that French had handed over in 1954, but actually it became a union territory only in 1962. Okay. And there was another major incident, which was, I had told you that it was 14th Amendment by which Pondicherry became part. So there was another 12th and 13th Amendment, just to mention all these amendments so that you remember, which was, as we had discussed earlier, the Goa, Daman and Diu, they were declared as the 8th Union Territory of India by amending the first schedule. Okay. And there was a 13th Amendment by which the formation of Nagaland happened. Okay, so we can just arrange them. So Goa, Daman and Diu, before that Dadar and Nagar Haveli, and then comes Pondicherry, and then Nagaland. Okay, so just keep it in your mind that what was happening. Meanwhile, side by side, a lot of things were happening. I'm just mentioning important things that can be key points to, remember other events. Okay, so we can just move on to another major part of Indian side, which was the economic side of India. Okay, so I'm just mentioning all the bullet points right now itself so that you can just read it, and while I discuss, you can just think about it also. So as we moved on to this second decade, that is the 1960s to 1970s, let us just see that or let us just analyze what was the economic situation in India. So we know that we had already begun with a motive to industrialize India, and that was something which was taken into consideration during the first and the second plan, 5-year plan. But anyhow, this war with China left us with many bigger issues in the economic front. Okay, the quest to quickly industrialize had caused a larger reallocation of funds away from the farm sector. Okay, so we know that our agricultural system or the setup was not that strong, or it was not getting enough consideration as it should have got. Agriculture outlay was basically halved to 14% in the second plan. So food shortages worsened, inflation spiked, imports of food grains depleted our precious foreign exchange reserves. So this was the economic situation which you are taken into, which you will see while you are journeying into the 1960s. Okay, so beginning in the 1950, India had faced a trade deficit. It actually increased by 1960. Okay, so the government of India had a major budget deficit, and therefore it could not borrow money internationally or privately. And there was many inflation also kicked in. And then this war with China in 1962, it worsened the situation, and it led to chronic food shortages and price rise. Okay, so this was something, the economic scenario which we had to face. Okay, so the large scale manufacturing industry was the only sector of the economy which had adopted modern techniques, because we were already focusing only on industrialization during the first and second 5-year plans. Okay, so modernization of agriculture didn't happen. And then because this Indo-China war happened, the government was of this view that we need to increase our expenditure or spending on defense sector. So a major diversion of funds from required sectors like agriculture, etc., went into the defense sector at this time. So these all were the scenario in economic situation we can see in India during this particular period. Okay, at the same time, we also had this great pressure of coming out of colonial deprivation, because as I had discussed in the last video, that we were already facing a huge problem of poverty, malnutrition, death, mortality rate, and these all things were already affecting us, and in midst of that, our economic policies were building up this kind of scenario. Okay, so as I had said, this is a program where we try to connect everything. Okay, so by this we mean that we need to know what was happening in one particular period, and also about events that had happened during this period. Okay, so now next we move on to another important thing that happened during this time. This is from another point of view, from a polity and a legislative point of view. We are taking this particular slide, and it is about the institutional and legislative advancement that had happened in India. Okay, so before we move on to specific legislative details of 1960s, let us quickly go through few important legislations of 1950s that we had missed in the previous video. Okay, it was first, I'll just quickly go through it, and then we'll finally keep them all in a timeline. Okay, this Khadi and Village Industries Commission Act. It was established in 1956. So what is this Khadi and Village Industries Act? Commission. It is basically an apex organization under the Ministry of Micro, Small and Medium Enterprises with regard to Khadi and Village Industries. Okay, it is basically to promote, facilitate and organize micro, small industries, micro, small and medium industries, and to bring in rural areas, or to develop rural areas and rural agencies. That is the basic idea about this Khadi Village Industries Commission. Okay, so you can just remember in 1956 this KVIC had also come. Another important thing that I had missed as an act in the previous video was the 1957's Mines and Minerals Act. Okay, so the Mines and Minerals Act, it was passed in 1957. Then we also see an amendment which had recently happened in 2016. Okay, so you can just relate both of these things. It is in current affair material also, and as a matter of fact, in following the timeline, you can find this Mines and Minerals Act. Okay, actually this act is applicable to all minerals except minor minerals and atomic minerals. So you can just remember that Mines and Minerals Act is only applicable to, it's applicable to all minerals except minor minerals and atomic minerals. Okay. So it details the process and conditions for acquiring a mining or prospecting license in India. So if you want to get a license, you have to follow the measures and rules and regulations mentioned in the Mines and Minerals Act. Okay. So it covers all minerals except for, minor minerals and atomic minerals. Actually, the minor minerals come under the purview of state governments. Okay. So that is the thing. So another very major legislative act that had happened in 1958 was the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. Okay, this is very important because it was in current affairs recently also, and about its lifting away. And we need to know in the timeline also, this is an important development. It actually grants special powers to the Indian Armed Forces that they can maintain, the power to maintain public order in a disturbed area. So for example, if there is a disturbed area and the governor of that area says that, okay, this place is disturbed, we cannot handle it, the administration cannot handle it. So what this act says is that the armed forces can go there and they can restore the public order of this disturbed area. Okay, in the beginning it was applied to Assam and Manipur region back then, and later on we also see that this Armed Forces Act was also established on Kashmir, on Punjab, etc. Okay, most of the northeast regions had to face, most of these regions. Anyways, this was something I had missed and I thought it should be remembered. So these three legislations had happened before in the first decade of our independence. Moving on to the 1960, another important event that had happened. See, basically this legislation is something I just thought of mentioning because Prevention of Cruelty Act 1960. So this is something which you can keep as a timeline start. Okay, so this is one particular thing about the welfare measure, and not just for the human being but also for the animals. Then in 1961, the Dowry Prohibition Act was passed, and also the Maternity Benefit Act. So I'm talking about Maternity Benefit Act over here because it is also a topic of current affair relevance, because recently this Maternity Benefit Act was amended. If you remember about this 26 weeks maternity leave, the 12 weeks being replaced with 26 weeks. Okay, so there was an amendment regarding that. So you should know when was this Maternity Benefit Act passed. This Maternity Benefit Act was passed in 1961, and it actually protects the employment of women during the time of her maternity, and it entitles her of a maternity benefit. Okay, just to remind you what the recent amendments were, let me just simply quickly say that it increased the maternity leave to 26 weeks. Okay, it also talks about providing creche facility at institutions for for children. And it also talks about compulsory education about maternity benefits, that every company or every institution should give necessary compulsory education awareness about this maternity benefit that the government is providing them. Okay, so these were the institutional legislative advancements that were happening. Again, in 1961 to 66, we had already started with a third 5-year plan. We'll be discussing about this third 5-year plan in later slides, so we'll just move on. So in 1961, again, another act was passed, which was the Institute of Technology Act. So this is something which I can say as one of the major acts regarding the development of science and technology, because in order to drive India's economic development and to build the industry that we were dreaming of, everybody or most of the major leaders, they were of the idea that we need to have scientists and engineers, okay, because it is very important. So there was already a demand for technical institutions which could be, related to just like the institutions in America, like MITs and all. So we started with this IIT Act, and already in 1958, throughout the 1950s, 5 major IITs were already established, which was IIT Kharagpur, IIT Bombay, IIT Kanpur, IIT Madras, and IIT Delhi. Okay, IIT Delhi actually was formed in 1961. So later, the IIT Act was enacted in 1961 to declare certain institutions of importance, which is certain institutions of national importance. This is something which, it's not eminence, it's institutions of national importance. Institution of eminence is something which we see in the recent, which we have been seeing in the news. It's not something, it's not that, it's just institute of national importance. Okay, so this list also includes NITs and IIMs in like addition to the IITs. Okay, so this was something which happened in 1961. And in 1963, we also talk about the establishment of CBI. Okay, so we'll be discussing about all these things in later slides, detailed discussion. So we move on. Okay, fine. So as we move from 1962, 63 to 64, the major event that happened during this time is the death of our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru. Okay. Jawaharlal Nehru died on 27th May 1964, and he was replaced or succeeded by Lal Bahadur Shastri as the Prime Minister. Okay. So he was actually he was a member of Nehru's cabinet, and he succeeded him as the Prime Minister on 9th June. Okay, so this is an important event because soon after taking over the prime ministership, Lal Bahadur Shastri had to face another tough situation or tough crisis that India had to face, and that was, you guessed it right, the second Indo-Pak War that happened in 1965. So in 1965, Indo-Pakistani War of Indo-Pakistan War, started, and it took place between April to September. Okay, and the reason behind this, the conflict began. The reason behind this particular war was that Pakistan had actually started with something called Operation Gibraltar. Okay, so what was this Operation Gibraltar? This operation was actually designed to infiltrate a large number of forces into Jammu Kashmir so that they can participate in an insurgency against Indian rule. Okay, so this was Operation Gibraltar, and this was not like by Indian side, of course, it won't be. And then India retaliated by launching a full-scale military attack on West Pakistan. Okay, so this was something that was developing, and so you come to know about Operation Gibraltar as a matter of fact. And in 1965, India-Pakistan War started. So the hostilities after this war, it lasted till September, as you know, and a huge number of civilians and huge number of military personnel had to die with this act. So this is something which was brought to ceasefire after the UN intervention. Okay, so hostilities between the two countries ended after a United Nations mandated ceasefire was declared following diplomatic intervention by the Soviet Union and the United States. So again, the ceasefire ended. The Pakistan War came to an end. The Tashkent Agreement was signed between India and Pakistan. So this was a year which was really important, not just in terms of this war stuff, but also the same day, the then Prime Minister Lal Bahadur Shastri passed away. But before we move on to that situation, the political situation that arose soon after the death of the then Prime Minister, we need to actually analyze what impact these two wars had on Indian economy. So we move on to the economic and social angle of these war years. Okay, so we'll be analyzing what happened after what were the situations between the Indo-China and Indo-Pakistan War and how things after the war changed in terms of economy. Okay, so by the time Shastri took over as the Prime Minister, the failure of the third five-year plan was clear. The growth in national income, it barely kept pace with the population growth, the prices rose substantially, and food grain became scarce. He tried to lower the role of planning commission. Actually, Lal Bahadur Shastri was not in that, he was not that favorable planning commission type of development. But anyhow, this was a situation which seriously required instant actions, and he tried to reduce the role of planning commission, and he brought in more expertise rules as such. So, considering the economic stagnation that India was in, Shastri wanted to promote agrarian growth in contrast to the earlier focus on heavy industry. So, here we need to know that during this period, focus was tried to be shift. There was a shift of focus towards agricultural growth rather than focusing on heavy industries. So there is one more thing to remember, that after the Indo-China war, there was a huge diversion of fund, as I had mentioned earlier, towards defense rather than on agriculture. But the ensuing poverty and famine that kind of followed these wars, there was a situation that arose where the focus needed to be shifted to agrarian growth. So here we are mentioning about an L.K. Jha committee report, but let me tell you a quick connection between this L.K. Jha committee and what happened in the background that led to the formation of Food Corporation of India. Okay, so as I had said, Lal Bahadur Shastri really wanted to focus on the technical advancement of the agricultural sector in India, and therefore he brought the technocrat minister Subramaniam to obtain suggestions for improving the current stagnant scenario. So Subramaniam actually he emphasized on promoting the private sector, technological innovation and foreign investment amidst a hostile leftist consensus. So it was during this time that a more market-oriented approach was needed, and Subramanian was of the view that we need to bring in more technological advancement in agriculture. We need to come up with better chemical fertilizers and irrigation policies. Okay, so based on these suggestions, a committee was formed, L.K. Jha committee, to look into the matter how we can face these agrarian crises. And based on this food shortage issues and all, the L.K. Jha committee report, it actually gave an idea of setting up something like Food Corporation of India, where the food can be stored and supplied during the crisis time. So this was the time when the Food Corporation of India Act was passed in 1964. So this corporation actually started working or came into existence in 1965 only, but then the Act was passed in 1964. Okay, so moving further, we know that the war was not an easy thing for India, because we had just started our moving as an independent country, and we had to face 2 wars, and we were almost left with no resources. So soon after the war, which ended with the Tashkent Agreement, in 1966, huge efforts were laid to restore the falling economic parameters. So it had a tremendous effect on India's economy. After the war, a shaky economy forced annual plans in place of 5-year plan. So as you know that we were working on the third 5-year plan during this period, but the third 5-year plan didn't come out well because it was actually affected by the Indo-China war in between. So India suspended the next 5-year plan for a short time, and it was replaced with annual plans, which was in 1966 and 1969. So there were annual plans instead of having a total 5-year plan. So this was done as the country was not in a position to commit resources over a long period. Okay. So the war with China led to have the following effects: that we had a below par growth outcomes of third plan, as I had mentioned earlier, and there was a diversion of capital to finance the war with Pakistan. So this had actually affected the economy severely, and it had severely weakened our economic situation. So based on that, the post-war events on economic front needed to focus on something that can immediately address these situations. So in the Indo-Pakistan War of 1965 led the US and other countries which were friendly towards Pakistan to withdraw foreign aid to India, which necessitated devaluation. So this was another effect of the war and on the economy, because most of our aid that was given by US was withdrawn because US was in support of Pakistan's ally. Then again, we can see that the constant need to import food grains, because we we know that agricultural situation was not that good, and we had to constantly import food grains, and for that we needed foreign aid because we needed foreign exchange. So that also led to a serious risk because our foreign exchange, our forex reserves were really depleting that time. So from fiscal year 1951 to the fiscal year 1979, the economy grew at an average rate of about 3.1% a year. So you get that? This is a situation that we have to keep in mind. And even while you are writing an essay or something related to economy, or if you are writing some answer related to the planning or any other post-liberalization event, you can keep these backgrounds in your mind. This will help you to build up better answers than otherwise. Okay, so after the war, with the help of Subramaniam, the same called Subramaniam, a three-pronged plan to improve the agrarian economy was advocated, and which later led to the very famous revolution in India that took place, which was the Green Revolution. Okay, it had actually started earlier, and we took heed from that Green Revolution, and we tried to implement those methods in India as well. So now we move on to this particular scheme of Green Revolution and its effect on Indian economy. So the Green Revolution started in 1965 with the first introduction of high-yielding variety seeds in Indian agriculture. This was coupled with better and efficient irrigation and the correct use of fertilizers to boost the crop. So these were the three areas that were focused, which was using high-yielding variety seeds, having better and efficient irrigation, and correct use of fertilizers. So this actual movement lasted from 1967 to 1978. It was actually soon after Shastri's death that the Green Revolution was implemented, but the idea was already in discussion during his time. Okay, Shastriji renewed his focus on agriculture. He accepted a larger role for private enterprise and foreign investment, and he trimmed the erstwhile planning commission. So actually there is this topic in our syllabus of mains where we need to know about different leaders of our country. So in post-Indian consolidation times and the post-independent time, these are the few figures that we really need to look on. Like they were actually directing the economy, they were shaping the economy. Okay, so Shastriji also had a great role in that, but unfortunately he could not continue with what he had started because of his untimely death. But this is something which shows that yes, Shastriji had an inclination towards more liberal economic policies than compared to his predecessor or even his successor. So in 1965, the Food Corporation of India was established based on the FCI Act 1964, and there was another major important incident that had come into place was the Agricultural Price Commission. Okay, we'll talk about it in the later video, so I'm just moving on. And also it was in 1965 that the special economic zones, the idea of special economic zone came into existence. Not per se special economic zone, but then yeah, export promoting zones were coming into existence. So these were the situation in India, and we have seen a lot of things happening, and even after the Indo-China War and the coming of Indo-Pakistan War and the economic confrontation after the death of the incumbent prime minister, and a lot of things to be pursued later. Okay, so before we move on to the next phase of Indian political as well as economic journey, let us just quickly go into the world view so that we get a glimpse of certain other aspects of world events that we should not be missing. So in the decade of 1960s, I would rather say, was a decade of rising of a lot of protests and civil rights and human rights movement as such. And this needs to be seen as something important because the continuation and the effect of those are still reverberating in our society. Okay. And to start with, of course, in 1960, there was a starting of anti-apartheid movement in UK. Because they were completely against, there was a movement which rose against the discriminatory policy of South Africa, so that the race-based discrimination, the color-based legislation. So that was one of the major important movement that had happened in UK. So we'll be covering a lot of things about this apartheid movement in the later videos as well, related to apartheid and legislations and development of South African politics. But yes, this was some important event, so I just tried to mention it. I tried to mention it over here. And the next movement which we see was the rise of civil rights movement in US. Now this is something important because the 1960s civil rights movement was actually something very important because it originated among Black Americans in the South who faced racial discrimination, and this movement gave one of the greatest, or I can say one of the very finest social activists of the 20th century, which is Martin Luther King Jr. Everybody knows his great speech that I have a dream, and of course I refer it all the time. I kind of read it, hear it all the time. Anyways, this civil rights movement is an important event, and it is also important related to the current events happening in US right now regarding the Black deaths and murders. So this is something important which we need to think in the line of civil rights movement. So this movement actually originated, as I had said earlier, in the South regions of America, because mostly in South regions, Black Americans faced racial discrimination and they were segregated. Or there was a separation between whites and blacks in almost like every aspect of their lives. So in 1960, actually, if you just want to know what kind of discriminations they had to face, the Black Southerners, they often had to sit in the back of public buses. Heights of discrimination. I mean, this is inhuman actually. But yeah, that was a situation there then, and I don't know if there is any particular change now. Anyways, and they were refused service in most of the restaurants, hotels, and still went to racially segregated schools. Despite there was a rule also that there should not be any segregation based on race for providing education, but then this was not kept in view of the rules and regulations were never to be followed, I guess. Yeah. So employment ads were also separate for Negro and white categories. So all these kind of discriminations were there. And in 1964, in the 1960s, this wave starts against these kind of discrimination. And by 1964, a huge civil rights movement originates, and under its pressure a lot of changes were brought in US. So this is something important, so that's why I just mentioned it. Apart from that, in 1961, another major event that happened in the world was the establishment of World Food Program. Okay, so we can just kind of mention, I have mentioned it because I'm just following the timeline. So World Food Program was established. So just to mention what World Food Program is, I think we need to quickly go through its establishment and its objective. Okay. So in 1961, because the World War II had just finished and not like it took like 15 years, but then still the effect of World War II was still severe, and there was severe hunger and food shortage all across the globe. So it was in 1961 that the first World Food Program was launched. So actually this is a food assistance branch of United Nations, and it is the world's largest humanitarian organization addressing hunger and promoting food security. If you are using Instagram, I think you can always see some of the other updates of World Food Program regarding food shortages and insecurity. Okay, so this World Food Program was established in 1961 after the 1960 Food and Agriculture Organization Conference. So it was only after this Food and Agriculture Organization Conference in 1961, the World Food Program was established, but it formally came into force in 1963. So you can just say that all these organizations could be related to the situations that were there. So no organization comes out of blue, but there will always be the situation that generates the need for some kind of NGO, some kind of civil rights movement, some kind of business movement, some kind of environmental movement. So it all depends on what kind of situation you or the countries or the regions were facing. So these kind of things help us to remember that yes, which year it could be, or what could be the background behind its formation. So what could be its objective? These all things can be guessed if you know the picture or the background of certain events. Okay. So currently I can say that the World Food Program actually strives to eradicate hunger and malnutrition with the ultimate goal of eliminating the need for food aid itself. Okay, so currently it's still providing food aid, so we can update with the current World Food Program reports. Okay, so in 1962, a UN resolution, which is known as the Resolution 1761, it condemned apartheid policy in South Africa. Okay, so this is all the beginning and the development of anti-apartheid movements all across the globe in different portions and different regions. And this is something important, so I just mentioned it. So in case you want to write something regarding the international developments of human rights or civil rights, you can just add it. Okay. Yet another issue that we need to face, or that we need to know, is that during this time where all these things were happening in India and human crisis was all happening and Korean War was happening, all this while there was another region of Southeast Asia which was facing another very big issue and leading to a big war, which was Vietnam. Okay, so the conditions in Vietnam was getting worse, and US was involving, or you can say butting a lot into the Vietnam affair. So I thought of just mentioning Vietnam War because it is something which is happening in our nearby region. So we need to know what was happening during this decade in Vietnam. Again, the rain has started, so I am sorry. This is Kerala. I mean, rain is incessantly over and over again. Okay. So the Vietnam War was a long, costly and divisive conflict that actually pitted the communist government of North Vietnam against South Vietnam. So again, just like Korea, there was also a division between North and South Vietnam. One side following the communist ideology and the other side, of course, being supported by US for its own ideology. Okay. So the Vietnam War and active US involvement in the war began in 1954. So as I had mentioned, it had already started, but increased US intervention happened only during the 1960s. Okay, so already US intervention involvement in the war began in 1954, and it stretched a lot. It lasted till the 70s. So we'll be just referring what was happening during this decade. So just to mention, in 1954, there was a battle called Dien Bien Phu. So you can just spell it like this: Dienbien. Dien Bien Phu. This was a battle that had happened in 1954. So after this battle, there was a conference called Geneva Conference, in which it was decided that the entire country of Vietnam will be splitted into two. That is North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and they were supposed to be divided by the 17th parallel. So as we had discussed regarding the Korean case, in the similar way, the Vietnam was also being divided along the 17th parallel. This was what happened in the Geneva Conference after the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. Dienbien. Okay, Dien Bien Phu. 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 I couldn't mention it here. I just somehow missed it. Okay, so after this Dien Bien Phu battle, so this happened. However, by 1960, there was some change in the southern part of Vietnam. Why? Because as I had mentioned earlier, that North Vietnam was communist-supported Vietnam, but in South also, even though the government was always favored by US, but the general civilians or the people over there, or not just people in the sense like the leaders, most of the leaders, they somehow were opposing the government. So we can say that by the 1960s, there were many opponents who rose in South Vietnam. They were both communist and non-communist. Okay, so there was generally a kind of discontent between the local general leaders and the government per se. Okay, so this opposing current system was taken seriously by US, because US said that if this kind of uprising happens here, then naturally their stand in the South Vietnam is at risk. Okay, so from 1961 onwards, America started building up its military and technical and economic aid to suppress such a threat. So they just wanted to somehow control it. So that is how they started building up their military base over there. Okay. So soon after, a coup rose in South Vietnam, against the government, and that leader during that time, DM, was executed. Okay, so and in this way, US soon retaliated, and there was a bombing raid. Actually, it's wonderful to know that code name was Operation Rolling Thunder. Okay, and it was in Vietnam, and during this time there was a bombing raid that happened. And in this bombing, it was not just Vietnam that was focused, but also Laos, the neighboring country Laos. And it was also bombed. Okay, so I'm just telling all these things because in order to know that what all kind of atrocious activities had been done in Vietnam by US, because this particular stand of US in Vietnam is going to generate yet another wave of civil rights movement in US. Okay, so it is related. So that's why I'm just mentioning it. And so by 1965, so as I had said, by 1962, the US military presence had increased in South Vietnam. And by 1965, US combat forces were sent into battle in Vietnam. And US was getting serious support from other nations like Australia and South Korea, etc. So this is the situation of 1962 to 1965, somehow we can say, when US presence in Vietnam was getting held. So this is important to remember because it was because of this Vietnam War that the Prime Minister of India, the then Prime Minister, that is Indira Gandhi, she spoke against. She critically spoke about U.S. stand in Vietnam War, and therefore we had issue related to the import of wheat and all, right? So okay, so we can go to that later, but yeah, Vietnam War was important. So therefore, we can know that in 1960s, an important war called Vietnam War was happening parallelly. Okay. So this was the situation in Southeast region, and if we mention Southeast region, we have to really, and we cannot forget about another region, definitely our neighbor country, China. Okay, so in 1966, there was this cultural revolution that was beginning in China under Mao. Okay, this lasted till 1976, but it's good to know that there was this cultural revolution which started in 1966. Okay, so in 1966 in China under Mao Zedong, another major cultural revolution was taking place. The cultural revolution was launched in China in 1966, so we know that by this communist leader in order to reassert his authority over the Chinese government. So because he had lost his assertion, and then they wanted to just create this cultural awakening and wild card entry or something like that. Anyways, so there was kind of a reassertion of his authority, and that's why while during this cultural revolution, he gave a huge call to the nation's youth, the younger generation, and he told them, and he kind of instilled in them this cultural awakening and said that you need to purge out all the impure elements of Chinese society, and we need to revive the revolutionary spirit that had led to victory in the Civil War like 20 years earlier, and that led to the formation of People's Republic of China. So the Civil War against the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, Communist as in the People's Republic of China was born with Communist Party gaining more control. Anyways, this reassertion okay, so if you remember in the previous video, I had mentioned about Kuomintang, who had to flee to Taiwan and form a government over there. Yeah, it's something related to that particular event that we are talking about. So after that civil war, he said that we need to reassert that revolutionary spirit and all. But this cultural revolution was not that easy one, because it led to death of nearly 1.5 million people, and millions others suffered during this time. So I mentioned it here because in 1966, while this cultural revolution was happening in China, in India, another influensive thing was happening related to this Communist Party, which was the Naxalbari uprising in the year 1967, okay, under the leadership of Charu Majumdar. So we'll be discussing its details when we discuss about Indian side, but then right now we are looking into the world affairs, so that's why I just mentioned it. Okay, so another major incident that was happening in the world during this time was in the year 1967 in the Middle East region, where Israel attacks Egypt to start the Six-Day War. So when I was mentioning the Suez Crisis, I had told you to keep that thing in mind because we'll be referring something related in the coming slides. So that's what I said. In 1967, there was this Six-Day War between Israel and Egypt. So just to mention about what the Six-Day War was, I'll just quickly go through this thing. So the Six-Day War was between Israel and Egypt, and it is also known as the June War or Third Arab-Israeli War of Naksa. Okay, so this war took place in June, and from 5 to 10 it lasted, and that was the third of the Arab-Israeli wars. So we know that the relation with Israel and its neighbors were not that good since 1948 after the Arab-Israeli War. And in 1956, Israel invaded the Sinai Peninsula. We know that, and that led to another crisis of Suez Crisis and all. So, but with one of its objectives being reopening the Straits of Tiran, because Egypt was kind of blocking all the straits for Israel. So this was one of the reasons why Israel had annexed the Sinai Peninsula, invaded the Sinai Peninsula rather. But Egypt was blocking most of the straits for Israel. So Israel was eventually forced to withdraw, but was guaranteed that Egypt had guaranteed that the strait would be reopened for them. Okay, so based on that, a United Nations emergency force was deployed along the border of this Sinai Peninsula and region around Egypt. Okay, but some months before 1967, again the same tensions began to heighten up. Because what happened is, some sort of blockages and all these kind of things again was reimposed. And Israel said that the position regarding Straits of Tiran, which was taken after the UN intervention and post 1956, should be reiterated, that it should be reinstated. But Egypt did not listen, and they started to block again and do that's how they do. And Israel won, and then anyhow, it led to a major conflict, and then a 6-day war ensued. But anyhow, in this war, Israel won. And when Israel won, it had almost got most of the regions, which included the Sinai Peninsula, Gaza Strip, West Bank, Old City of Jerusalem, and Golan Heights. So, I think this is something regarding the Israel-Palestine issue, the two-state issue and all. So, we can, if you want to really deeply go into this topic, you can follow this link, which is an article in ClearIAS about Israel-Palestine conflict. You'll get a complete history with years, and that will kind of help you in building up a nice narration about the Israel issue. Okay, so this was the thing. So as I had mentioned earlier, that in 1967, when US was too much getting into Vietnam's affair, there was a protest going against this stand of USA in USA itself. Okay, so there was a massive Vietnam War protest outside Pentagon, which was mostly included students, and of course the civil rights movement activists also participated in this protest movement. So the Sinai Peninsula, I think there, you can see this, yeah. So the Sinai Peninsula, okay. So 1967, 1966, so these were the world affairs that we were looking into. So as I had said that we won't be just looking into world affairs as such, but we'll also be looking into other subjects. So when we are talking about world affairs, there was another major thing that had happened, which was in the decade of 1960 to 1970, was declared as the first United Nations Development Decade. So from now on, the events that I'm mentioning will be just mentioned because we don't need to deeply go into why and how, but it is important. That is why I'm just mentioning. Okay. So in 1963, another incident. So here, there is something that we need to remember. which is the group of 75, which became the group of 77. This is an important incident because India is a member of group of 77, where because most of the developing countries, they came into grouping under G77. Okay, so in 1964, another UN conference on trade and development. You remember about this, we learn about UNCTAD a lot. So this was formed or established in 1964. And then in 1965, the World Population Conference, the second World Population Conference, was held in 1965. International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination. Again, this is something important because we need to remember about the UN conventions. So the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination had occurred in the year 1965. We can definitely relate it to many other things because the civil rights movement was already happening in US and the anti-apartheid movement was already happening in South Africa. So this convention had to come. So that is it. And also another important thing, the United Nations Development Program, UNDP, was formed in 1965. So you already know that UN had declared its 1960 to 1970 decade as first United Nations development decade. So naturally UNDP could be formed only during this time. Just a guesswork. Okay, so these are the few important topping events that we need to remember. So that's why I'm just mentioning it here. So as we move on, let us get into another aspect of this video, which is learning about the environmental developments that happened during this period. So we start with the year 1961. It was in this year when the Worldwide Fund for Nature came into existence. It was originally just known as Worldwide Fund, but then later it became Worldwide Fund for Nature. And it aims to stop the degradation of the planet's natural environment and to build a future in which humans live in harmony with nature. So it's like a harmonious existence that it aims for, preservation of wilderness as in. So it is this Worldwide Fund which releases its Living Planet Index, and this Living Planet Index has been they've started releasing this index since 1998, and it is released once in 2 years. It's a biennial report, and Worldwide Fund is also behind the starting of the initiative called Earth Hour, and also an initiative called Debt for Nature Swap. Now we move on to the next fund. See, as we will be going through the timeline in future, when we reach 1998 and all, we'll be discussing about the Living Planet Index in detail. So I'm just mentioning events as we come across them in the timeline. Okay. So the International Convention for the Prevention of Pollution of the Sea by Oil, this was updated in 1962. Actually, this convention was established in 1954, but it was later in 1962 there was an updation regarding the same. So just to mention that there is a convention regarding the pollution of oil pollution in open oceans and seas. Okay, so this is something important which you can take into consideration while you write the environment answers and all, and water pollution related questions or areas. This particular convention is administered by International Maritime Organization. Okay, so this is something that you can remember. It is in the year 1962. So we can see the idea of pollution, the idea of human coexistence with wilderness was developing. And we had mentioned in the last video the establishment of IUCN in 1948. So the environmental activism can be seen in this timeline, and also we can see the development of focus, or the changing of focus regarding environmental concerns during this period. Next important thing that had happened was the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which was signed by the US, UK and USSR. It was signed in 1963, and it was a treaty for banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in the outer space and underwater. So it actually prohibited all test detonations of nuclear weapons except for those conducted underground. Okay, so it was a test which banned nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in the outer space and underwater, but they could conduct tests underground, within their ground. So this came into force because, as I had mentioned earlier, in 1962 there was this Cuban crisis, and therefore we nearly escaped a nuclear war because almost things were really constrained during that time. So this partial nuclear test ban treaty came into force in 1963. Later developments are something like after partial nuclear test ban treaty, then it was updated into limited test ban treaty, which is LTBT, and then finally the comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. So we'll be dealing with comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty with the year as it comes. Okay. We move on to Vienna Convention on Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage. So this is something which happened in the year 1963. And again, an important convention because it aims to harmonize the national laws of the contracting parties. So, for example, if some country is having a contract with another country to set up a nuclear reactor or a nuclear power project, something like that, then there is this requirement of civil liability. That is, if any sort of accident happens or some sort of damage, nuclear damage happens, then with whom lies the liability and how? This is the kind of convention which deals with the same. And International Atomic Energy Agency is what is responsible or, involved with this particular convention. Okay, it was discussed in the 1963, but it was adopted in 1977 by, or we can say that most of the countries signed into this convention by 1977 only. So in India, I just wanted to mention it here. We'll be covering it in 2010, but then definitely we need to know something here because something related to Atomic Energy Act of 1962 is coming up. So as I had said that according to this convention, any country which is contracting nuclear power plans with another nuclear energy related projects, which is safe use of nuclear energy. That is something to be marked. The safe use of nuclear technology. So if any country is having a contract with any other country regarding safe nuclear technology usage, then they should have their own national legislation regarding that. So India passed its Nuclear Civil Liability for Nuclear Damage Act in 2010. So it was actually a highly controversial act during that time. But something that we need to remember for this decade is that in this civil liability for nuclear damage, after this act was passed, there was a certain change made in this Atomic Energy Act of 1962. Okay, it's like it allowed private parties to be members with the nuclear technology. So this Atomic Energy Act is something which is important, which was passed in the 1962 and amended in 2010 by allowing private participation in nuclear related activities. Okay, safe nuclear technology activities. And in 1964, the IUCN publishes its first red data book. So this is again something that we have mentioned because we know that IUCN came into existence by 1948 and it came up with its first red data book, the book which contains the information about the critically endangered, vulnerable, threatened animals. Okay, so this is what the timeline says about environmental legislative developments or concerns. So this is the an altogether picture of important environmental matters that had happened during this decade. Moving from the environmental aspect, now we are going into the conditions existing in India. But before we go into the political scenario, let us just quickly revise, or actually let's quickly see what all kind of developments were seen in the field of science and technology during this period. So as we know that we had discussed in the previous video that in the that when this Atomic Energy Commission came into force, and also we talked about the contributions made by Dr. Homi Bhabha in the field of nuclear technology and researches. So again, as we see here, that based on this nuclear technology development, India had almost started to invest in nuclear power-based energies, and in 1955, the world's first nuclear power reactor was established by the Soviet Union, and in India also we got major support from Soviet regarding nuclear technology. Anyways, the roots of nuclear power in India lie in early acquisition of nuclear reactor technology from a number of Western countries. Also, particularly, there was this American support for establishing the Tarapur Atomic Power Station. So this was the first atomic power station that came into existence and also was commissioned by 1965. So on October 11, 1960, the Indian government issued a tender for India's first nuclear power station near Tarapur, Maharashtra, and it consisted of 2 reactors with their respective capacity, and it was commissioned in the year 1965. Also, in 1961, Indian and Canadian governments had agreed on conducting a joint study on building Canada-India nuclear power plant based on CANDU reactor. Moving from nuclear technology, again, this decade was very much famous for something else, and that was the development in the field of space technology and programs. So actual Indian space program had received its financial support from the Soviet Union since the beginning, okay, and it somehow helped in building up our base for the Indian Space Research Organization. Okay, and so therefore we can say that in nuclear and space technology, both Soviet and US had a major contribution. And the Indian Space Research Organization achieved its aims, such as establishing the Thumba Equatorial Rocket Launching Station with the help of Soviet Union. An Indian National Committee for Space Research was established by Jawaharlal Nehru in the year 1962 under the Department of Atomic Energy. And, there was a scientist behind this, and a very famous scientist, Vikram Sarabhai, who was a pioneer in this field and also a major contributor to the field of space technology and program in India. This this committee for space research later became ISRO as in its current form in 1969. It is important because recently in the after the corona effects, with considering the 5 pillars that were suggested by the reforms suggested by the finance minister, privatizing ISRO was also one of the suggestions that had come up during this time. So I think all these things do have a reference. So if you, in order to know the background information, this is helpful. So ISRO came into being by 1969. Moving on, there was also certain contributions made in the field of telecom technologies and etc. So we'll just quickly go through the things that had happened. Like the first attempt to develop an indigenous electronic exchange was initiated at the Telecom Research Center in the 1960s. And the first breakthrough was a 100-line electronic switch that developed in 1973. So it took decades after India's independence to set up telephone connections and make it India-wide networking. Okay. And the Department of Electronics was established in the year 1970. So these are the few examples that we can just keep in mind while discussing about the science and technology during this decade as a whole. We'll be covering more of the things, and also the green revolution that we had discussed, which was in talk since 1965 and officially started by 1967. Started in 1965 till 1967. This green revolution had its own impact in the field of agricultural research, because we started researching on the high yielding varieties of seeds and also producing chemical fertilizers. So that too had a role in the development of agricultural science in India. So moving on from science and technology, let us get into the Indian side, and let's see what was the political build-up soon after the death of Lal Bahadur Shastri. As we had discussed earlier in this video, that after the Indo-Pak War, Lal Bahadur Shastri died after signing the Tashkent Agreement that same night. So after this starts yet another era of Indian political history, because soon after his death, a leadership election was held, and this resulted in the elevation of Indira Gandhi, who was Nehru's daughter, of course, and everybody knows that. I'm adding it as a new information, who had been serving as the Minister for Information and Broadcasting, and she was elected as the next or the third Prime Minister of India. So Indira Gandhi succeeds Lal Bahadur Shastri as the Prime Minister after she defeated Morarji Desai in this leadership election that I had mentioned. So, and later on in 1967, the general elections come in, but um, she defeated the but Congress party somehow just got a reduced majority. Okay, so the majority was not that uh, great compared to the previous years, and there were many reasons behind that. Because of widespread disenchantment over rising prices of commodities, unemployment, economic stagnation, and food crisis. So, as we know that we have just emerged out of the war situation, and there were a lot of things that we need to take care for, and monsoon also was not that favorable, and war had already resulted in diversion of fund from agriculture. So all these things had led to poor production, more poor production, and more the rise in the prices of the commodities, and also resulted in a large number of unemployment. So these were the situation. These were the economic situation soon after Indira Gandhi was sworn in, and let's move into this particular situation, because this is something really important, that what was the economic and social situation right now there, and also the kind of policies adopted by the then government. Okay, so Indira Gandhi had started on a rocky note after agreeing to a devaluation of the rupee. Okay, so let's just see what had happened and why this happened. Okay, so Gandhi had actually inherited a weak and troubled economy, and with fiscal problems associated with the war with Pakistan in 1965, along with a drought-induced food crisis that spawned famines, had plunged India into the sharpest recession since independence. Okay, so you can just see what sort of economic situation was being built up or was happening, was in and around India. Okay, so she started with devaluing of money. That's what I had mentioned right now, that in return for the restoration of foreign aid, because for this, as I had mentioned earlier, that we were running out of the foreign exchange because of poor production and more imports of food especially. So this had led to a draining of foreign exchange in India, and therefore she started her work with devaluing of money. This is considered as one, and I think one of the few liberal steps that she had taken in the beginning. But devaluing of money created a lot of hardship for Indian businesses and consumers. And then the Indo-US relations also were not that good, because Gandhi was, she was a critique regarding. I'm so bad at this. I'm really sorry. I cannot do that. I hope you follow the cursor. Okay, so she actually was against the Vietnam campaign of USA. So you know that in Vietnam, we had discussed earlier in the same video about involvement of US in Vietnam and how it escalated by 1967, and Indira Gandhi was a critic of American bombing campaign in Vietnam. So this had kind of strained India-US relationship, and this had led to an issue regarding wheat importation. The wheat which were being imported from United States fell through due to this political disputes. Also, in light of the circumstances, liberalization became politically suspect and was soon abandoned. So, see, basically, devaluing of money, etc., was considered as few of those liberal steps that she had taken. But because of the social situations and considering the constraint, the stress she had to face from different business and consumer angle, the liberalization policies had to be abandoned. Okay. Now, the next thing that she focused on was the grain diplomacy. Okay, the grain diplomacy and current. Okay, because this is something very important, because India was totally dependent on other countries for its own food security. Okay, so let us just quickly go into the major policies or the major decisions that was taken by the then government regarding building up the economic situation of that time. So firstly, we can say that in 1967, Gandhi started with a 10-point program. So it actually emphasized greater state control of the economy. So see, this is also a state controlled program or idea which she also followed. So with the understanding that government control assured greater welfare than private control. Okay. And also by the end of the 1960s, the reversal of liberalization process was complete. So, as I had mentioned earlier, when Lal Bahadur Shastri was on the throne, was on the seat of prime ministership, he was also more favorable towards private involvement than a complete state-controlled process or governance, because because we had seen how he was cutting short the role of planning commission and was involving expertise and private partners. But anyhow, his untimely death, and then later on with the coming of Gandhi, few liberal steps were not that entertained. I mean, they were not entertained much among the Congress and a few of the major leaders among themselves. So this had to reverse. So the liberalization process that had somehow begun, it completely ended by 1960s, and India switched on to more protectionist kind of tendencies. Okay. The Green Revolution in India, it subsequently culminated under her government in 1970s. So the thing that was discussed in 1965 rose to heights in 1967, culminated under her in 1970s. And this Green Revolution actually transformed the country from a nation heavily reliant on imported grains and prone to famine to being largely able to feed itself. This is one of the greatest achievement we can say during that time, because food insecurity was something that was really creating a big problem. So we can go into that. This was one of her major achievement. So beyond that, as we were talking about the devaluation, let's just simply see why it was devalued and what was the situation. Okay, so I'll just give you a discussion about that, so a shorter analysis of that point. So she started with the devaluing of money in return for restoration of foreign aid. As I had mentioned, that this particular stand had created hardship for Indian businesses and consumers. And as we know that India had a humiliating defeat in the 1962 war with China, so this necessitated India to strengthen its defense. So India had to import a lot of arms from the foreign countries, and this again depleted India's foreign exchange reserves to dangerously low level. Okay, and to get out of this situation, rupee had to be devalued from 4.76 to rupees 7.50. Okay, so actually this devaluation aimed at boosting exports and bringing in foreign capital into the country. So it was a necessary measure to avoid a financial crisis in India. So it was a step in right direction of reforming the economy. But this is where I had said that this step stopped there itself. So the direction of reforming the economy through further process of liberalization could not be carried out due to widespread opposition from left parties and even within the Congress. So that was what we had mentioned. Okay. So during Indira Gandhi's period, especially, we can say that that the devaluation process and also her stand on agricultural front was really beneficial for the Indian economy, because that led to less dependency on import, and also it helped in building up the self-sufficiency in agriculture and also in building up our forex reserves, because we were less dependent on the imports. So moving on from the economic situation, let us get into few political scenario or struggles that was really at its heights during her time. And one among them is the year 1966, when the state of Punjab was bifurcated to create to create Haryana. This was the 17th state of the Indian Union in 1966, and it was bifurcated into state of Punjab and the Union Territory of Chandigarh. So actually this followed the demand for a separate Sikh homeland. So there was this Sikh homeland movement, and this homeland movement actually was based on a demand for sovereign Sikh state for themselves, and this demand was on since the early 1940s. And it was also during the Jawaharlal Nehru's time that this demand started building up or increasing its momentum. So this was raised by the Akali Dal, under the leadership of Master Tara Singh. So later on the recommendation of Shah Commission was what happened in this in this period, that the Punjabi-speaking areas were constituted into the unilingual state of Punjab, and the Hindi-speaking area were constituted into the state of Haryana, and the hill areas were merged with adjoining union territory of Himachal Pradesh. Okay, so this was what happened in the 1966. Well, this issue was not to be subdued yet because it was to become for Indira Gandhi the cause of her death, and also a lot of other things that is going to build up in the coming decades. So yes, so this was not the direct cause of her death, but I'm just building up the scenario. That's it. Okay. Then, meanwhile, this was happening in Punjab. In the east region, another major movement, or we can say uprising, had happened, which was the Naxalbari uprising. Okay, so the Naxalbari uprising had happened in the year 1967 in a village in Bengal called Naxalbari. Okay, so actually, this uprising was based on a demand for the right to the crops at a particular piece of land. Okay, so it was mainly led by local tribals and the radical communist leaders of Bengal, and it was further developed. Developed into this movement developed, or we can say kind of led to the division or the separation of Communist Party in 1969, forming Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. Okay. So this is a major event. They even became an inspiration to the Naxalite movement, which rapidly spread from West Bengal to other states of India, creating division within the Communist Party of India. Okay, so this is something important in the year of 1967. So as we were mentioning about Mao's Cultural Revolution of 1966, I had told you that something important is going to happen in next year parallelly. So, so we can just remember that how the development of leftist ideologies and activities, or we can say this kind of more radical movements were upcoming in the year 1967. Okay. In the political front, while we were discussing about the Naxalbari issue, another major issue, or we can say another major case that we need to refer over here is regarding the Golaknath case. Okay, so the famous Golaknath case, as we refer this Golaknath case a lot of time, we have read it a lot of times in Polity. So let us just quickly get into what this case was. So actually, this Golaknath, actually his full name is William Golaknath. He, and along with his family, held over 500 acres of farmland in Punjab. Okay, so in 1953, the Punjab state government, it passed an act, something like Punjab Security and Land Tenures Act 1953, and based on that act, it came to a fact that these brothers, that Golaknath and his brothers, had to lose rest of their land. That is, out of 500 acres, they will only be left with 30 acres each. Okay, and few acres were transferred to tenants, and the rest was declared as surplus. So because they had 500 acres and now they are left with only 30 acres each, so this was not liked by Golaknath ji, and he went on to Supreme Court with a case which is known as the famous Golaknath case, and it is here where we can see a lot of changes in the Supreme Court stand. So what are the major features of Golaknath case? We'll quickly get into this Golaknath case, because this was challenging the Punjab Act based on Article 32, because you can go to the Supreme Court directly when you feel that your right to your fundamental rights is being violated, and they claim that the fundamental right of property and practicing of any profession has been violated, and also about equality before and equal protection of the law based on Article 14. Okay, so let's just get into what are the major features of Golaknath case, just for reference. The judgment of Golaknath case actually reversed Supreme Court's earlier decision regarding amendability of constitution, or especially mentioning amendability of fundamental rights in the constitution. Okay, so this question was already raised in the previous case of Champakam Dore Rajam, where Supreme Court said that okay, the parliament can amend fundamental rights, but here it reversed its stance, saying that the parliament was left with no power to curtail one's fundamental rights. Okay, so the constitutional amendment under Article 368 of the Constitution, it also stated another important declaration, that the amendment is just an ordinary law within the meaning of Article 13. This is again being reversed in the following cases to come. But just remember, in Golaknath case, they said that Article 368 based amendment is just an ordinary law. And because it is just an ordinary law, it comes under review, and therefore if it is violative of any of the fundamental rights, it will not be taken in. Okay, so then this constitutional amendment could not be in violation of fundamental rights. And it was also an important event or important case where another doctrine, which is called as the doctrine of prospective overruling, was used or invoked by the Chief Justice while delivering this judge overruling. Let's just quickly get into the doctrine of prospective overruling, because sometimes UPSC also asks about these kind of doctrines, not just judicial doctrines, but administration-based doctrines and principles also do come in. So, doctrine of prospective overruling, it actually originated in the American judicial system. The literal meaning of the term is overruling, basically overruling. That is the right to overrun or overturn or set aside a precedent by expressly deciding that it should be no longer by controlling law. I think you didn't get it, but it's basically a statement saying that if you have passed one judgment, you can overrule it based on substantial facts in the later judgment. So something like that. Okay, so this was the doctrine of prospective overruling. So, if you want to just learn about important judgments that transformed India, there is a book with the same name, Important Judgments That Transformed India, by Alexandros George, the founder of ClearIAS. You can buy this book and refer this. This is important in UPSC aspect, because there are a lot of cases that we need to refer and write in the polity as well as in UPSC essay writing basis. So, this can be really helpful to get a complete idea about the cases that transformed India. It includes Keshavananda Bharati case, one of the major cases that we always discuss. Okay, moving on. So from the 1960s, economic regulations were really tightened, as we had discussed that the state turned into more of a protectionist form of policies, economic policies. So we can say that from 1960s, economic regulations were tightened, and there were few acts based on that came up. So we'll just quickly discuss what those acts were. Okay, so the first one was the Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practice Act of 1969. It came into force in 1970 only, but this act aims to prevent concentration of economic power and provide for control of monopolies and protect consumer interest. So this is something called Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Acts to prevent concentration of economic power. Later on in 2000s, when we come across, we'll see that this is being replaced by Competition Commission. So anyways, we'll just discuss it when we come across that year timeline. Okay, the nationalization of 14 large commercial banks. This is another major incident that had happened in the year in this decade, and that was nationalization of 14 large commercial banks. This happened in the year 1969, and majorly 14 banks, they held 85% of bank deposits in the country at that time. So they were nationalized, and the primary objective behind the nationalization was to energize priority sector at a time when the large business dominated credit profile. So basically, the credit was already moving on, the credit thing was working, but the credits were not being directed to priority sectors like agriculture and small enterprises, etc. So this was aimed that if it comes under government control, they can redirect the credit to priority sector. Okay, so even though the banks lent credit, the dispersal to the rural areas and small-scale borrowers were very far less as compared to the industries. Okay, so despite Banking Regulation Act 1949, this was not happening. So therefore, nationalization of large commercial banks was the step taken by the government. Okay, then moving on, let's just see that then again another important act is this Patent Act of 1970. This was passed in the year 1970, came into force in 1972 only. It replaced Indian Patents and Designs Act of 1911, which was during the colonial time. The Patents Act was largely based on the recommendations of Iyengar Committee report, and one of the major recommendations was the allowance of only process patents. So normally we see that there are product patents in most of the Western countries, but here we focused on process patents with regard to inventions relating to drugs, medicines, food and chemicals. So this entire patenting process and intellectual property right related area is very important, considering current relevance and also other major developments that had happened in the past and in the current timings. So it's very important because after a few years we'll be signing these TRIPS, and according to that there will be necessary changes that need to be brought in. So we'll be discussing that once we get into that. So next important thing that had happened, or the policy that was really impressing on the economic scenario then, was the industrial licensing policy of 1970. It actually followed the industrial policy of 1970. So we had discussed many industrial policy resolutions. So this is one of them. So the policy defines a sector called heavy investment sector, and it consisted of industries involving investment of more than rupees 5 crore. So all those industries which had investments more than 5 crore, they were opened for private sector. Okay, except few which were reserved for public sector, as we had discussed in the IPR 1956. Okay, then industries involving investment between rupees 1 crore and 5 crore, they were included in middle sector, and licensing policy was considerably liberalized and simplified for these industries. Okay, so this is a licensing policy, because if you are somewhere in between 1 crore and 5 crore, you can easily get license compared to the other industries. And the setting up of industries involving investment of less than rupees 1 crore, they do not require any license. So this was the way how industries were given license to work, okay, under the government control. So these were the important scenario of 1960 to 1970 that we had discussed. So moving on, before we finish this video, as I had mentioned earlier, we'll be covering few important topics that could not be discussed at that point of time because it seemed like blocking the flow of the video. So I've taken them aside so that we can discuss it separately. And a few of those topics that I've taken, and one of them is, the first one to start with is Food Corporation of India. So let's just quickly see what and how and when all these things kind of, I'm blabbering literally. Okay, so if you have come this far to till this video, you have done a superb job, because it's seriously a long video. Okay, so it was set up under the Food Corporation Act 1964, and the primary purpose of the Food Corporation of India included the purchase, storage, movement, transport, distribution and sale of food grains and other food stuff. The objective was to safeguard the interest of farmers, maintain buffer stocks for food security, and make grains accessible at reasonable price for the weaker and vulnerable section through the public distribution system. So recently there have been talks on FCI reforms based on Shanta Kumar Committee report and its role in the current scheme of integrated management of public distribution system. So these are the current topics of importance. So that's why I just mentioned them. So just to remember what FCI is and when it was formed and its objective. Next one is Agriculture Pricing Commission. So this was also one topic that we had discussed while we were discussing about the economic and legislative developments of 1965. So this was another thing. So in the year 1965 began with the setting up of Agricultural Prices Commission, which was later renamed as the Commission for, let me try it once again. Okay, it was later renamed as the Commission for Agricultural Costs. I'm really bad at this. And this is CAPC. Okay, so the mandate was to recommend minimum support prices. So this is important, minimum support prices, and raise productivity and grain production. So just remember about CACP, it recommends. So just remember that it just recommends the minimum support price. It is fixed by the Economic Affairs Committee. So today CACP recommends MSPs for 23 commodities, which includes 7 cereals, which is paddy, wheat, maize, sorghum, pearl millet, barley, and ragi. 5 pulses, which includes gram, tur, moong, urad, lentils. 7 oil seeds, which include groundnut, rapeseed, mustard, soybean, sesame, sunflower, safflower, nigger seed, and 4 commercial crops, which includes copra, the dried coconut, sugarcane, cotton, and raw jute. So this is about Agricultural Pricing Commission, which is now known as the Commission for Agricultural Costs and Prices. So let's move on. The next important thing is the third 5-year plan, which we had discussed in the 1960s era, but then we didn't go into the details, so let's just get into that. So in the third plan, emphasis was on long-term development. Okay, so the third plan report stated that during the 5-year period, which started from 1961 to 66, the Indian economy must not only expand rapidly, but at the same time become self-reliant and self-generating. Well, very flowery words, but nothing of this could happen because of the Indo-China War and then the later Indo-Pakistan War. So the objectives, when it was being planned, they were clear. It said that it is an increase in national income of more than 5%. So just to remember that by this time we had never crossed the 4% rate, or the Hindu rate, which we normally call it. So this third 5-year plan kind of aimed to increase the rate by 5%, but this didn't happen. The investment pattern laid down must be capable of sustaining this growth rate in the subsequent years. An increase in agricultural produce to achieve self-sufficiency. But remember, the self-sufficiency could be achieved only by 1970s, or we can say actually in between 1965 to 1970, because that was when the Green Revolution happened. So before that, we were still not functioning well. Expansion of basic industries. The aim was to meet the requirement arising from increased industrialization within 10 years. This was also aiming at increasing the employment rate. Then again, it also aimed to utilize country's manpower, as I had mentioned, to maximize the employment rate. The greater equality of opportunities, more even distribution of economic power, and reducing wealth and economic disparities. So I think this was added directly taken from DPSP or something, because they just needed some flowery good words, so they just added it. Okay, so the assessment. The third plan was a failure, because now from by this time you already know what was the reason of failure. So we can just add few facts to that by saying that the planned target was met only in transport, communication, and social service sector. Otherwise, there was a fall in agricultural production, and there was a considerable rise in the prices of food products and consumer articles. Industrial production also fell below expectation. So again, Chinese aggression, poor monsoon, Indo-Pak War, and lack of coordination between central and state government. This is an important point to mention. Lack of coordination between central and state governments. We'll be following the political scenarios later on as it builds up. Now, following third 5-year plan, and because we were not in a position to deploy more resources into another 5-year plan, so we thought of going into annual plan schemes, which were known as plan holidays, lasted till 69. So it started 1966 till 69. So what were these plan holidays? Due to miserable failure of the third 5-year plan, the government was forced to declare plan holidays, which lasted for 3 years, 1 year each. We had annual plans. 3 annual plans were drawn during this intervening period, and during 1966 to 67, there was again the problem of drought. Okay. Equal priority was given to agriculture, allied activities, and industrial sector. The government of India declared devaluation of rupee to increase the exports of the country. So this happened during the plan holidays times. Okay. The main reason for plan holidays were the lack of resources and increase in inflation. Okay. Fine. So moving on, another important thing that we had discussed during that time in this video was the special economic zones. So just quickly go what in relation to special economic zones happened in India in the 1965 or 60s region. To provide fiscal incentives to industrialization, infrastructure and technology, the instrument of a special economic geography was created in 1965 in Gujarat with the setting up of Kandla Free Trade Zone. I think this Kandla has been renamed as Deen Dayal Upadhyay Port, I guess, if I'm not wrong. Okay, so this was the Asia's first export processing zone. So we cannot completely call it as special economic zone because this idea of special economic zone or per se in in policy, it came only in the 2000s. But this idea of setting an export processing zone happened in 1965. So, however, a major policy to develop these sorts of zones came in 2000 with the special economic zone policy. It aimed to overcome the shortcomings experienced on account of the multiplicity of controls and clearances. So, to make it in a simple language, we can say that it was just maintained to have industries and investments to have hassle-free functioning because of avoiding large number of red tape activities. So absence of world-class infrastructure was tried to be overcome, and also unstable fiscal regime will not affect export processing over here, and also to attract larger foreign investments. They provide a lot of tax incentives also to industries who set up to business partners or corporates who wanted to set up their industries here in the special economic zone. After extensive consultation, the Special Economic Zone Act was passed in the year 2005, supported by SEZ rules. It came into effect by 2006, providing for drastic simplification of procedures and for single window clearance. Okay, these are matters that we will be discussing again in the 2000s era. But then, just to mention, because Special Economic Zone was not something that just cropped up in the year 2000, but it was already been in discussion and had been in practice since the 1965. Okay, so just to know that we were the first one to do that. Okay, so this is all about the years from 1960 to 1970. Thank you for listening to me all this time, and don't forget to subscribe to the ClearIAS channel. And as every YouTube video says, that click on the bell icon to get more notifications and stay tuned for more videos. And yes, so try to follow the links that I had mentioned earlier in the video, and we'll come with next video on the next decade. Till then, take care, prepare well, and God bless all.